Do you have ambitions to be the Prime Minister of this country?
Oh, well, if you've... You
Yes.
needn't have made all that fuss about that. Yes, of course.
Enoch was the best parliamentarian I ever knew. Everything in Enoch's speeches had to be worked out in reason from first principles.
Pamela Powell remains her husband's most loyal supporter. She says she's come to expect having their lives turned upside down every few years, for Powell has spent a lifetime provoking controversy. He'd been born in a thunderstorm in Birmingham in 1912. His parents were both school teachers. The young John Enoch Powell was so precocious that he was nicknamed the Professor. He won a scholarship to King Edward's Grammar School, Birmingham, where he was known as Scowly Powley. He established himself as brilliant at Greek and Latin. A contemporary at school was Christopher Evans.
He was fiendishly clever, and we were all rather frightened of him, as I think were some of his masters, actually. He was so good, and rather knew it, I think. You know.
Powell volunteered when war began and says he spent the happiest time of his life as a private soldier in the Royal Warwickshire Regiment. But he had high military ambitions and was soon to rise with record speed through the ranks. The army had quickly spotted Powell's intellectual and linguistic talents, and he was sent for training as an intelligence officer. Powell was sent to work as an intelligence officer with the 8th Army in North Africa. His task was to get inside the mind of the German Army Commander General Rommel by deploying his professional skills as a textual critic. The secret signals sent by Rommel's Africa Corps were all being intercepted by the British. And though Rommel was known as the Desert Fox, Professor Powell came to understand more about the general's plans than anyone else in the British Army. After the British victory at Alamein, Powell was to become the only private soldier throughout the war to reach the rank of brigadier. He was posted to India and slept his first night on Delhi railway station. Although he'd promised his wife a life of grinding backbench poverty, Powell's political star was soon rising. The father of 2 daughters presented an ideal family man image. He was an intellectual who was good with his hands. He made all the bookshelves and picture frames in his house. As he began his climb up the ministerial ladder, Powell was talked of as a future Tory leader. He'd been appointed financial secretary to the Treasury, where he presented a picture of rigorous austerity. But in 1958, Powell suddenly resigned, along with the Chancellor Peter Thornycroft, in protest against increased public spending. The Prime Minister, Harold Macmillan, dismissed the resignations as a little local difficulty.
He was, of course, the very first person to realise that inflation had nothing to do with prices and incomes. It was to do with the money supply. And if you put the money supply up, then up would go the prices and incomes. But it was the money supply, therefore the interest rate, you had to look at. And he was the first person to realise that.
Within 2 years, Powell was back in the government, this time as Health Minister. And ironically, in view of his resignation, he now became an enthusiastic public spender as the economy boomed. He had grandiose plans for increased health service expenditure.
How far are these, in fact, paper plans? Because the estimated expenditure on the hospital one alone is 500 million, and I think you say that...
Oh, it's up since then. You've been looking at the first edition. The hospital plan has been revised and carried forward another 2 years since then, and the new 10 years is a 600 million programme. That's England and Wales. But this is going to happen, and no one, short at any rate of a world war, can stop it.
While the Health Minister was happy to pose with his daughter Jennifer in nurse's uniform, he preferred to cooperate with the media on his own terms.
Excuse me, Mr. Powell, will you be letting your name go forward as a candidate?
I'm saying nothing at all, so don't waste your time.
Do you think your party's chances will be enhanced by a new leader?
In 1965, with the Tories in opposition, the party leadership had become vacant after the resignation of Sir Alec Douglas-Home. Now there was speculation as to whether the favourites for the leadership, Ted Heath and Reggie Maudling, would be challenged by the maverick outsider Enoch Powell.
Gentlemen, Mr. Powell, sorry to trouble you. Could you just confirm that you are standing?
I can't do anything at all. Can't do anything.
There is a report, sir, that you are standing.
I can't do anything at all.
No
Sorry,
problem
it's
at
so
all.
disappointing.
All right, Mr. Powell,
so
many
sorry.
thanks.
Heath won the leadership, but Powell, as he puts it, had left his visiting card. In the shadow cabinet, there were no early signs of the bitter divisions to come between Heath and Powell. By 1968, Enoch Powell had become a recognisable political figure, but a colleague detected worrying symptoms. Poor Enoch, he remarked, driven mad by the remorselessness of his own logic. Powell was now developing an ideology markedly to the right of Ted Heath's, above all on the taboo subject of race. Powell was alarmed at what he saw as the dangers of coloured immigration to the British nation. His views seemed to contrast sharply with his professed love for India. The issue of race was to bring Powell into confrontation with Heath. Powell decided to quote directly from the experiences with immigrants of his white constituents. Only parts of that polemical speech were filmed, but Powell has kept his original text. He began by attacking the Labour government's bill that outlawed racial discrimination.
The discrimination and the deprivation, the sense of alarm and of resentment lie not with the immigrant population, but with those among whom they have come and are still coming. This is why to enact legislation of the kind before Parliament at this moment is to risk throwing a match onto gunpowder.
Powell quoted a letter he said he'd received about an elderly widow living in Wolverhampton, the only white resident left in her street. He quoted from the letter, "She's becoming afraid to go out. Windows are broken. She finds excreta pushed through her letterbox. When she goes to the shop, she's followed by children, charming, wide-grinning piccaninnies. They cannot speak English, but one word they know, racialist, they chant."
Those whom the gods wish to destroy, they first make mad. We must be mad. Literally mad as a nation to be permitting the annual inflow of some 50,000 dependents who are, for the most part, the material of the future growth of the immigrant-descended population. It is like watching a nation busily engaged in heaping up its own funeral pyre.
Powell ended the speech with a quote from Virgil translated from Latin. "As I look ahead, I'm filled with foreboding. Like the Roman, I seem to see the river Tiber foaming with much blood." It was that line, not filmed at the time, which gave the speech its Rivers of Blood title. As the storm broke in the press, the Times condemned it as an evil speech, and there were growing demands for Ted Heath to sack Powell from the shadow cabinet.
I remember Ted ringing me up on Sunday morning, because it was all over the Sunday papers, saying Enoch must go. And I said, look, I would just wait and just read the whole speech and just think about it for a few days. No, he must go. Everyone says he must go. And I gathered later there would have been resignations from shadow cabinet if Enoch hadn't gone. I thought it was a conclusion jumped to far too rapidly if you looked at the logic and reason in his speech.
And the Smithfield meat porters marched on Parliament with a petition.
There's 2,026 signatures there to say that Mr. Enoch's right, that we have the right to say who we like and who we don't like. This is not a racial problem. All we say is that we've got enough immigrants into the country and that no more should be allowed in.
2,000 signatures in 2 days.
Related to the press, 88% of Slough people say they support Enoch Powell. 88% Slough people.
As Powell's fans besieged his Belgravia home, his 11-year-old daughter Susan kept a diary of events.
It was all very exciting as a child. The police were there, and in my diary I refer to the letters that arrived, and we used to have our own Royal Mail van purely for Daddy, bringing sacks and sacks of letters. And on the Thursday, the 23rd of April, for example, we'd already had 23,000 letters. And the next day there were 50,000. And I remember sitting round the dining room table along with other friends, just slitting letters. They just piled up, and this was incredible.
The great majority of the letters to Powell were in his favour. At Tory conferences, Powell now became the darling of the party's right-wing activists. But his leader, who declined to take part in this programme, was not impressed.
Too often today, people are ready to tell us, this is not possible, that is not possible. I say, whatever the true interest of our country calls for is always possible.
Powellism reached parts of the Tory party which Ted Heath could never reach. And Powell was now staking his claim for Heath's job.
This is Enoch Powell.
Enoch Powell has emerged, in some senses, as the real leader of the Conservative Party in this campaign. But for those who doubt this, the final proof of Powell's power is that Heath dare not attack him publicly.
Mr. Powell is officially accepted Conservative candidate. He's been chosen by his Conservative Association. And like all Conservative candidates, I want to see them elected.
The cartoonist depicted Powell waiting like a British General de Gaulle in exile at Wolverhampton-les-Deux-Églises for the call to lead his nation. But Powell was no idle exile.
Good morning.
Good morning, sir.
Yes.
He sought to get over his ideas and build up his image in every way he could.
Is your husband from home?
And you could put with love from under that.
Yes, I could. I could, but I shan't. I say this is marvellous television, isn't it? The desk is over there.
He accepted a string of invitations to speak on the Tory rubber chicken circuit across the country.
You are aware, are you not, that I'm opening a garden party?
Yes.
On the Saturday afternoon.
Mm-hmm.
Hat, dress. There's a ladies' luncheon. There's a YC wine and cheese. There's a tea club. There's a wine and beer. One hat for the wine, one for the beer. And there's a ward supper. Now, will you kindly tell me how many hats and how many suitcases that represents? Because that's what's got to go into the car.
As the Tory government ran into mounting political trouble, Powell became the Prime Minister's bête noire. He was forever deriding Heath's economic U-turns. As a preacher of Tory fundamentalism, Powell had a secret female admirer within the cabinet, both for what he had to say and for the way he would say it.
He spoke in a way with his whole body. If he wanted to emphasize a point, you would see his hands going, and his eyes were powerful. And his voice was much more powerful in those days than it is now. So this combination of impeccable and implacable reason from first principles applied to whatever was the debate in hand.
You don't tax a loss. You only tax a profit. You raise more, the more profit there is to tax. We all live on the profits of British industry. It's a truism. And those people have been gravely misled who imagine that there's one set of people, remote people, somewhere over there who live on profits, but the rest of us don't. We all do. We are all in this together. And the future of all of us is bound up with the future of free British industry.
It was Europe that was to cause the final break between Heath and Powell. Ted Heath's application for Britain to join the common market aroused Powell's nationalistic feelings, even though, ironically, Powell had himself once been a pro-marketeer like Heath.
Je suis convaincu que nous vivons un moment historique comparable à celui d'il y a 20 ans.
As the anti-marketeers marched on number 10, Powell prophesied that our entry into Europe would never happen and the bill to take us in would be defeated. In February 1974, Powell suddenly announced he would not be standing in the general election, and he compounded the shock by calling on all anti-marketeers to vote Labour because the party was proposing a referendum on our membership. And at a packed anti-market meeting on the eve of the general election, Powell denied he was betraying the Tory party. He told his audience he didn't need any lessons in political consistency from Ted Heath.
Now, there are a lot of people about whom it behoves to be very cautious in accusing their political opponents of past or prospective U-turns.
So the elector, let us admit, Judas was paid. Judas was paid. I am making a sacrifice.
We were all shocked, very shocked. And the vote Labour, of course, was, you know, even worse. As I say, when you've worked for somebody and turned the seat round from a socialist, very safe socialist seat to a Conservative seat, and followed this man and worked for him and admired him and been loyal to him, we all found it devastating, really.
Heath lost the election by the narrowest of margins. And once again it seemed that Powell's intervention had had a decisive effect, as the anti-Tory swing was more marked in the West Midlands than anywhere else in the country. By the end of 1974, Powell was again an MP. The Wolverhampton Wanderer had become an Ulster Unionist with his own idiosyncratic policy. He proposed that Ulster lose its separate status and be completely integrated with Britain. Once again, Powell seemed happier attaching himself to an apparently lost cause. Yet within 5 years, a new Prime Minister was actually putting Powell's economic theories into practice. Mrs. Thatcher was said to carry in her handbag extracts from his speeches. But Powell could summon up little public enthusiasm for the Thatcher brand of monetarism.
Would you say, economically, that you are a Powellite?
I would say economically we both hold the same views, and I originally got them from Enoch, but also, of course, Keith Joseph took them up and we developed them very much in the Centre of Policy Studies, and they are now the orthodox views. And I hope that I was just a little bit of a help in putting them into practice and seeing what they could do for the British people.
Enoch Powell celebrated his 83rd birthday at a friend's house earlier this year with his family and his grandchildren. The Powells have now been married for over 40 years.
That's an A. A for apple. Go and tell Grandpa that.
The poems he once used to write to an imaginary woman are now written to Pamela Powell.
A good beginning.
Alpha.
Alpha.
Enoch Powell is now working on a new interpretation of the Greek Bible. As a classical scholar, he can reflect on the supreme irony in his own life, that the Rivers of Blood speech transformed him into a national figure, yet at the same time ensured he would never be given charge of the nation's destiny.